Samuel Taylor Coleridge was a poetic genius, but he did not live his life. Hey, come on in, Tracy. He did not live his life that way at all. Before he was 30 years old, he battled rheumatism. He tried to temper his pain with opiates, and he became addicted. He found a good friend in William Wordsworth, another poet. He was closer to Wordsworth than he was his own wife. That was not a good thing because Coleridge fell in love with Wordsworth's sister-in-law, and that pretty much destroyed his own marriage. In time, his addiction became worse. He alienated his friend, left Coleridge at the lowest point of his life, and eventually, though he was able to control his addiction, and after several years of recovery, he and Wordsworth renewed their friendship. Coleridge wrote something called Youth and Age, a collection of his observations about life. And in one of his writings, he wrote about his friend Coleridge and said, "Friendship is a sheltering tree." Friendship is a sheltering tree. That's a pretty profound way to think about friendship. The way that friends spread over us, the way that friends provide shelter and shade from outside forces. Tonight, after we see why David so desperately needed some friends, we're going to see some people that were what just described, that sheltering tree. And we're going to find a couple of other people, not so much. So we're in 2 Samuel chapter 15. And we read this last week. We didn't talk a whole lot about it, but I want us to read it again to kind of set the stage for the rest of the chapter, reminding us why David so desperately needs friends. So if you'll look in 2 Samuel 15, beginning in verse 1, I need a reader. Dakota, you're hired.
It's his day off.
Told you. You could read 1 through 12 for us.
At 15, 2 Samuel 15.
Yes.
After this, Absalom got himself a chariot and horses, and 50 men to run before him. And Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way of the gate. And when any man had a dispute to come before the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, "From what city are you?" And when he said, "Your servant is of such and such a tribe of Israel," Absalom would say to him, "See, your claims are good and right, but there is no man designated by the king to hear you." Then Absalom would say, "Oh, that I were judge in the land. Then every man with a dispute or cause might come to me, and I would give him justice." And whenever a man came near to pay homage to him, he would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. Thus Absalom did to all of Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And at the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, "Please let me go and pay my vow, which I have vowed to the Lord in Hebron. For your servant vowed a vow while I lived at Jeshur in Aram, saying, if the Lord will indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will offer worship to the Lord." The king said to him, "Go in peace." So he arose and went to Hebron. But Absalom sent secret messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then say, Absalom is king at Hebron." With Absalom went 200 men from Jerusalem who were invited guests, and they went in their innocence and knew nothing. And while Absalom was offering the sacrifices, he sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city Gilo. And the conspiracy grew strong, and the people with Absalom kept increasing.
Okay. All right, so let's talk about Absalom's actions first. The first thing you'll read Absalom does is he provides himself, and the Hebrew says magnificent chariot, not just a chariot. He provides himself a magnificent chariot with 50 runners to precede it. That's royalty. That's make way, here comes Absalom. So he's setting himself up, pretty much that action, he's claiming royal status. Now, right or wrong, he's in line to be king, but he's taking full advantage of that. So he goes out, go ahead. Oh, I thought you were going to say something. I'm
I
sorry.
was just going to mention that having the chariot itself is unusual because it wasn't part of the norm. Remember, they burned all the chariots, they did all that stuff. So it had to be something that made him look bigger than maybe he really was.
That's a very good point. It's more of a status symbol,
Yeah.
than anything else. Yeah, very much so. So what should be happening at the gate is that David or one of his advisors should be there on a regular basis, because what would normally happen is during the morning hours, the people of Jerusalem, the people of Israel, would go to the gate and they could have a hearing either with the king or with one of his representatives. Apparently, for whatever reason, they're not there. But Absalom's more than happy to be there. And he's fully leveraging the situation. And you can imagine this. Whoever comes to Absalom, their case is right. Whether their case is right or not doesn't matter. But in that moment, their case is right. And if only somebody could just give you justice, obviously just teeing up and trying to endear himself. Meanwhile, you find this conflict of someone who commands for himself a chariot, but so you see where his heart really is. But when people bow to him, he just reaches out, no. We're just people here. Fake humility. Just trying to do that. Now, he uses religion as a cover to get out of town to go to Hebron. There's a lot of places he could have gone. Why Hebron?
Well, that was the original. That's kind of, people were not happy necessarily that Jerusalem was made the capital.
Yep.
Hebron was the original place that that they believed to be the right town, if you want to call it, for all of the religious activities. That's where I guess the synagogue was, and so forth.
Eventually. So you could contextualize it this way. I don't know how many of y'all are into different sports stuff one way or the other. The Oakland A's right now are moving to Las Vegas. And they're moving because Oakland is Oakland. Enough said. The city there has had multiple opportunities to save the baseball team. They haven't, whatever. And I'm not saying going to Las Vegas is one of them. I don't really care. But if you're in Las Vegas, you're like, hey, Major League Baseball's coming to town. If you're in Oakland, it's like, man, we had a team for 50 years. What are you doing?
They have no teams now.
Yeah,
Zero.
they've gone from 3 teams to no teams in 4 years.
Yeah.
Because even Golden State has moved across the bay, even though they still call them Golden State. Now, we're kind of on the other end of that because today we heard that there are going to be 2 games in London next year, a home and a road game, just to make people feel better. But the national narrative becomes London Jaguars, and not that rankles anybody here at all. But so Hebron has a little bit of a complex, that's what I'm saying. Why don't you move all this to Jerusalem? Now, David in 2 Samuel 5 was also made king in Hebron. So you've got significance to this city. And Absalom takes 200 people with him, and none of them know what he's up to. They will soon know what he's up to. And when they know what he's up to, they're trapped. Because by the time they figure out what Absalom's been up to the whole time, if they they can't get out of that. They are literally stuck between a rock and a hard place. Now, let's see if I can find this. Before he went to Hebron, I don't want us to skip over this one little phrase at the beginning of verse 7. At the end of 4 years, all that stuff at the city gates, all that chariot stuff, all that making promises and telling lies in the best political fashion you can imagine, went on for 4 years. Why didn't David do anything? David had 4 years. Why didn't he do anything?
Busy with other matters, I suppose.
Took his eye off the ball.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Or he took his eye off the ball.
I think both.
Yeah.
I think both.
What's interesting to me is some of the stuff that Absalom does are things that you see Solomon talk about or David talk about in Proverbs, like of what. And so if David's not paying close attention, Absalom's doing things right. Like he's gathering counsel, he's helping people out and things like that. If he's not paying close attention, so on the surface, it doesn't look too bad.
So,
It's David has a lot of problems unless he's fighting.
that's a really good.
When the weather is clear, he doesn't,
That's when trouble comes. And that's its own sermon. So we found that Ahithophel joins this rebellion very willingly and very quickly. He is the grandfather of Bathsheba. So just file that away in the back of your memory bank. So there's a little ulterior motive with Ahithophel. Eliam was one of David's mighty men. And when it comes to Ahithophel, David basically killed his grandson-in-law. So there's a little something extra going on there. All right, so we know David's in a spot where he needs some friends. So let's see what evolves here. So a messenger came and told David, the hearts of the people of Israel are with Absalom. Now, side note really quick. I would point out to you, if you read the rest of this chapter, you would argue with verse 13. Now, David knows better, but it seems like in the rest of this chapter, there are a lot of people that are really with David, especially the way people around him tend to act. But David does pick up on what is said in verse 13. So David says to all of his officials who are with him in Jerusalem, come, we got to get out of here, nor none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us, bring ruin on us, and put our city to the sword. We'll come back to that in just a minute. King's officials answered him, your servants are ready to do whatever our Lord the king chooses. The king set out with his entire household following him. He left 10 concubines to take care of the palace. So the king set out with all the people following him, and they halted at the edge of the city. All his men marched past him, along with the Kerethites and the Pelethites, and all the 600 Gittites who had accompanied him from Gath. They marched before the king. So the king said to Ittai the Gittite, isn't that fun to say? Why should you come along with us? Go back and stay with King Absalom. You're a foreigner, an exile from your homeland. You came only yesterday. Today shall I make you wander about with us when I do not know where I am going? Go back, take your people with you. May the Lord show you kindness and faithfulness. But Ittai replied to the king, as surely as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king may be, whether it means life or death, there your servant will be. So David said to Ittai, go ahead, march on. So Ittai the Gittite marched on with all of his men and all the family that was with him. All right, let's talk about David before we get to Ittai. David has a choice, fight or flight. He chose flight. Why did he choose flight?
He didn't want the city destroyed.
He loves Jerusalem. And he knows what will happen if he stays. Innocent people are going to die, and Jerusalem is going to suffer incredible harm. And you see that kind of played out because when this battle actually takes place in the forest, just how savage it is. So he's right on point. This rebellion is going to be quite difficult to put down. And if you're David, you got to be wondering, who can I really trust right now? We'll see some people that he can and he can't, but you got to wonder. Yeah.
So far, we have not seen him trusting in the Lord. He may have been.
Yeah, not at this point. Not at this point.
That's my point, yeah.
Okay, not at this point. So the Gittites, you remember the good old Gittites, they come from the city of Gath. They were Philistines. This particular group of 600 of them, under the leadership of Ittai, had formed an alliance with David. And Ittai had developed as you see, quite a kinship with David. So what does Ittai really owe David? Correct answer.
He was with him getting ready for the battle. When they were getting ready for the battle, he was with him at that time, wasn't he?
Yeah.
And when they told him to go back, he didn't want him fighting, didn't want David fighting. I think that's when that relationship was kind of.
It got stronger.
I was gonna say, what he owes him is what any two people who've been through stuff, whatever that stuff is, owe each other. Loyalty, have you back.
Okay. All right, good. Is there anything David can promise Ittai?
A battle.
Jump in. Might not be pretty.
Wasn't there a treaty between them that David would protect him?
There's a treaty in place for David to offer protection, but David's not really in a spot where he can. So that's just another layer. Does Ittai place any conditions on his loyalty? None whatsoever. Now, Jewish tradition, the Bible doesn't say this. Jewish tradition says Ittai was a son of Achish. And you remember Achish from when David aligned himself with Achish in 1 Samuel 29. What can we learn from Ittai in this passage?
Yes, you don't have to be family. You can.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. By life or by death, I'm here. We all want a friend like that, don't we?
Yeah, really.
Kind of interesting though that where's he been? When you read the verses, you see that he just came there. It's like you got here last night. We're leaving in the morning.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could stay here with Absalom and be just as safe. Or at least that's what David thinks he could do.
Sure.
Because he's just another group of 600 men that could help
Yeah.
do whatever. So kind of unusual, I think, that would happen in such a quick fashion.
Which makes you wonder, there was something about David maybe that just really drew Ittai. We don't hear of him after this, by the way, which makes one wonder if he may or may not have survived the battles that came along later. But once we have this incident in Ittai's life, we don't read of him later on.
But you know, that's the message in itself. The message isn't whether I survive or die in the battle. The message is loyalty and fealty and staying true to your commitments.
Absolutely,
I mean,
regardless.
Ittai's first response is, as Yahweh lives, like, as sure as Yahweh lives, like,
That's a Philistine saying that.
yeah, that's,
Philistine.
yeah,
So where does he learn that from?
yeah, exactly. And so there's that bond there of like, you've kind of brought me into the fold of the true God, you know, and
Now, that is a reason for loyalty.
yeah,
Yeah, good point.
But he was really loyal because remember, if you go, I'm jumping forward, but when the battle starts, he puts him in charge of a third of all his troops.
Yeah, he does. Yeah, he does. All right, the whole countryside is weeping, it says in verse 23, which it's interesting that the hearts of the people are with Absalom, they may have been, but the whole countryside is weeping aloud as these people pass by. The king crossed the Kidron Valley, all the people moved toward the wilderness. Now, let's see who we're introduced to next. Zadok was there, and all the Levites who were with him were carrying the Ark of the Covenant of God. They set down the Ark of God, and Abiathar offered sacrifices until all the people had finished leaving the city. The king said to Zadok, "Take the Ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it and his dwelling place again. But if he says, I'm not pleased with you, then I'm ready. Let him do with me whatever seems good to him." That's an amazing statement. King also said to Zadok the priest, "Do you understand? Go back to the city with my blessing. Take your son Ahimaaz with you, and also Abiathar's son Jonathan. You and Abiathar return with your 2 sons. I will wait at the fords in the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me." So Zadok and Abiathar took the Ark of God back to Jerusalem and stayed there. Now, this is our first sign that David's not just running away and hiding. David is starting to plan. So if you're David, why don't you want the ark to be with you?
Either God is with you or he's not, right? And you want the Ark of the Covenant falling into the hands.
That has happened.
And it has happened.
So David has learned something from history and from his own experience that you don't treat the ark of the Lord like a good luck charm. He knew what happened when the ark had been carried into battle before Saul even became king. So he knows that that's what happens. David knows that the ark belongs in Jerusalem because it's a symbol of the Lord's rulership over Jerusalem, over Israel, whether David's king or Absalom's king or whoever's king. The ark there means, no, God is really still king, at least in David's mind. Hey, Scott, how you doing, man?
How are you? Part of this?
So David, when he says in verse 26, if he says, I'm not pleased with you, then I'm ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him. David, in effect, is saying, God is real king.
yeah.
And God will either reinstall me or he will not reinstall me, but that's God's doing. It's not my doing. For Zadok and Abiathar, their duty is to follow the king's instructions and to trust him. And that's not an easy thing to do at this point, because what David is promising them is a different kind of hardship than Ittai, but it is still hardship, and it is insecurity. And if they get found out, it could be death. So in spite of all that, Zadok and Abiathar basically, with their lives, say to David, whatever you wish me to do, I will do. I am available to you. And that is a great, great depth of commitment that could cost them so very much. But Zadok and Abiathar honor what the king asked them to do. David continued up the Mount of Olives, verse 30, weeping as he went. His head was covered, he was barefoot. All the people with him covered their heads too. They were weeping as they went up. David had been told Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. So David prayed, Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness. That's what next week's going to be all about. When David arrived at the summit where people used to worship God, Hushai the Archite was there to meet him, his robe torn, dust on his head. David said to him, if you go with me, you'll be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, your majesty, I will be your servant. I was your father's servant in the past, but now I'll be your servant. And you can help me by frustrating Ahithophel's advice. Won't the priests, Zadok and Abiathar, be there with you? Tell them anything you hear in the king's palace. Their two sons, Ahimaaz and Zadok, and Jonathan, Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, Jonathan, the son of Abiathar, are there with him. Send them to me with anything you hear. Hushai, David's confidant, arrived at Jerusalem as Absalom was entering the city. All right, tell me about Hushai. What gets your attention about him in this passage? His initial plan is, I'm going to go with David. David says, no, you're not.
Be my spy.
Yeah. He's been put in a very difficult position as well. He's going to be the spy.
It's interesting that I can't figure out the geography on this. Mount of Olives. Haven't have been there, y'all may have too. You can see Jerusalem. It's on top of it. How is this happening with all these men and he's on in the seeing distance of the city of Jerusalem? Because that just, you look right out over it, right on top of the city, which is only 11, how many acres?
11 acres.
Yeah, 11 or 12 acres.
Yeah.
So it's always, when I read this, I can't figure out how all these 600 men and these 300 men and all that could be hiding somewhere unless he's by himself and his men is some other place.
Yeah.
The side of the hill.
I've always just seen it kind of as a caravan that's coming along and that Hushai just seems to meet up with. I think it's really interesting though that he prays that God will make the wisdom of Ahithophel foolishness, and they get to a God location, and there's this guy who's there who shows up, right? Like they get to the summit where people worship God, like people have God experiences, and there's this guy who's there who's going to turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness. Like it's like God just saying, okay, here you go, David. Like, here's the answer to the prayer, you know?
Yeah, very good point.
But he's obviously in mourning, like over everything that's happening to David. He's witnessed all this and he's in mourning coming to support David.
Shows love for David, loyalty to David.
I don't remember what your translation had, but in the literal here, it says his coat was rent and earth on his head. Earth on his head, I take that to be essentially like ashes.
Yeah.
I don't know that it's exactly the same, but for all intents and purposes, it's the same kind of mourning and yeah.
It's like that David already knew Ahithophel, if you pronounce that right, was not going to go with him.
Right.
I mean, he had to have that. God gave that information to him in some way or whatever, because why would you think this guy was supposed to be originally, a chapter ago, his advisor, one of his chief advisors. So he must have had some warning that that he was going to tell him one thing and he didn't want him to, he wanted to let him go ahead and tell that, and the other guy come by, or whatever his name is, would
And then
give a different.
And then for the Lord, David just to say, Lord, turn his advice upside down.
Yeah.
And turn it into foolishness. And again, next week we will see He gives some really foolish advice that Absalom follows. And then he actually gives some wiser advice that's not followed. And as a result, he takes his own life.
Yeah.
So David's got friends in very difficult moments. Ittai is a great friend. Zadok and Abiathar are great friends. Hushai is a great friend, willing to pivot when I've got this I'm going to do for you. And David says, no, this is what I really need for you to do. And Hushai is like, whatever you need. And there he goes. He doesn't question what David asked him to do. He's not offended when David says, this is not where I need you.
Again, that's deep loyalty,
That's very deep.
not about me.
Now, the next one we're going to read about is somebody that looks to be equally a good friend, but maybe not. When David had gone a short distance, chapter 16, when David had gone a short distance beyond the summit, there was Ziba, the steward of Mephibosheth, waiting to meet him. He had a string of donkeys saddled and loaded with 200 loaves of bread, 100 cakes of raisins, I wouldn't have wanted that, and 100 cakes of figs and a skin of wine. I won't say whether or not I would have felt about that. The king asked Ziba, why have you brought these? Ziba answered, the donkeys are for the king's household to ride on, the bread and fruit are for the men to eat, the wine is to refresh those who became exhausted in the wilderness. The king then asked, where's your master's grandson? Ziba said to him, he's staying in Jerusalem, because he thinks tomorrow the Israelites will restore to me my grandfather's kingdom. The king said to Ziba, all that belongs to Mephibosheth is now yours. I humbly vow, says Ziba, may I find favor in your eyes, my lord the king. All right. If you're hungry and you are on the run and someone shows up with these kind of provisions, this is a really good friend, or so you think.
And you say Trojan horse.
So this little side comment, though, chapter 3, David, by the way, where's Mephibosheth? Well, he's staying in Jerusalem because he thinks today the Israelites will restore to me my grandfather's kingdom. You have read further in this before. Is that true? No, that's not true. So he's playing David at a very vulnerable moment. Apparently Ziba's already figured out this, or has an idea that this rebellion is not going to be successful. So he totally misrepresents Mephibosheth. Now, David's in a spot, though, where he doesn't have time to go check that out. His life's on the line right now, and he's got things in place, and this train is rolling. So he can't call the time out on the field to go investigate what's really going on with Mephibosheth. He's got to make a call and move on. And that's what he does. So Ziba in this moment appears to be a good friend who's actually leveraging that for his own benefit. You may or may not have ever dealt with somebody like that in your own business dealings, in your own personal dealings. But it definitely happened to David. Ziba's going to get found out later on when all these loose ends start getting tied up. But for as far as at this point, he seems to have gotten away with it. Now let's look at somebody that just doesn't even pretend to be a friend. As King David approached Bahurim, a man from the same clan as Saul's family came out from there. His name was Shimei, the son of Gera, and he cursed as he came out. He pelted David and all the king's officials with stones. through all the troops and the special guard were on David's right, or even though all the troops and the special guard were on David's right and left. That's pretty brazen, by the way. That's pretty bold. As he cursed, he got in a few words that weren't curse words. He said, get out, you murderer, you scoundrel. The Lord has repaid you for all the, watch this, all the blood you've shed in the household of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. The Lord has given the kingdom into the hands of your son Absalom. You've come to ruin because you are a murderer. Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, says to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head. By the way, if Abishai had just said that to you and you were David, how many of you would have said, go my son in peace and fulfill what you have suggested? David wisely says, what does this have to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? If he's cursing because the Lord said to him, curse David, who can ask, why do you do this? That's very interesting. David then said to Abishai and all of his officials, my son, my own flesh and blood is trying to kill me. How much more then this Benjamite? Leave him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will look upon my misery and restore to me his covenant blessing instead of his curse today. So David and his men continued along the road while Shimei was going along the hillside opposite him, cursing as he went, throwing stones at him and showering him with dirt. The king and all the people with him arrived at their destination exhausted, and there he refreshed himself. Why is Shimei such a pain in the rear end?
He had grievance.
He definitely had grievance. What tribe's he from? Benjamin, tribe of Saul. If you're from the tribe of Benjamin, how excited are you that the kingship now comes from the tribe of Judah?
Not very.
Okay, not so much. Did David shed any blood in the house of Saul?
Very carefully did not.
Oh, he went to extraordinary lengths not to shed any blood. Now, maybe Shimei blamed David for the deaths of Abner and Ishbosheth. You couldn't honestly, but he's not in a state apparently of rationality. If he was in a state of rationality, he would not have been hurling stones and cursing at the king and all of his bodyguard around him as he's leaving town. So he's obviously not in a rational stance in life.
He knows that Joab did kill him though.
Yeah.
And he knows Joab. I mean, how many times do people go out and do something without an authority to do it? Joab did do that, but
Might have wondered otherwise. Yeah, sure. What interests me, it's not that the rest of this isn't interesting, but one of the things that really interests me is that apparently David is convinced that Shimei's curses are really coming from the Lord. Do you think they were coming from the Lord, by the way? I'm just curious.
I think the scenario was orchestrated by God, yes. The words not necessarily, but
That was a loaded statement, wasn't it? Because while I don't see God necessarily cursing David in this way, this whole thing is orchestrated for God's ultimate purpose to prevail.
well, it also sets up David to make a good choice.
Yeah.
Because you're right. I mean, he's got all these bodyguards around him. Thinking this guy could be dead in 12 seconds, right? And he holds his hand.
And David did not have trouble killing people when it was just to do so. When the runner came back to him with the information of Saul's death, David had, and basically took credit for it. David had no trouble basically saying off with his head. It is very interesting for David to say if his own son would turn against him, of course a Benjamite will turn against me. Don't be surprised by this. So we've seen friends, we've seen not friends. We're going to skip ahead and look at one more group and then we'll be done for tonight. And then we're going to go back and pick up loose ends next week. Jump ahead to chapter 17 and go down to verse 24. And this is right before the actual battle is enjoined. David went to Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed the Jordan with all the men of Israel. Absalom had appointed Amasa over the army in the place of Joab. Amasa was the son of Jether, an Ishmaelite, who had married Abigail, a daughter of Nahash, the sister of Zeruiah, the mother of Joab. Just try to work your way through that. The Israelites and Absalom camped in the land of Gilead. When David came to Mahanaim, watch these interesting people. Shobi, the son of Nahash from Rabbi of the Ammonites, Machir, the son of Amiel from Lo-Debar, and Barzillai the Gileadite from Rogelim. They brought bedding and bowls and articles of pottery. They also brought wheat and barley, flour and roasted grain, beans and lentil, honeys and curds, sheep and cheese from cow's milk for David and his people to eat. For they said the people had become exhausted and hungry and thirsty in the wilderness. So we've got Shobi, Machir, and Barzillai. Shobi is from Ammon. How has David treated the Ammonites? Do you remember when they defeated the Ammonites? He lined them up all and he said, we're going to basically line the rope and say, we're going to kill two, spare one, kill two, spare one. All right, that's how David treated the Ammonites. And Shobi is from Ammon. He's got a great excuse not to give David any help. Machir is from the desert. He's from Lo-Debar. And he was the one that took Mephibosheth into his own home. So he's got every reason to say, I don't have time for this. Barzillai is 80 years old. And it's easy for him to say, I'm too old for this. All three of them had an excuse to do nothing. Instead, they band together, they work hard, and they load up every supply they can think of, and they go off to help their friend who's in need. Maybe you've had a friend like that before, who just, they had really no, as far as you know, they had no great reason to help you. But in that moment of distress, they drop everything and they just show up. And they just show up because they know that you need them. These are really, really good friends. So, how can I have in my life a friend like Ziba? A friend like, not like Ziba. How can I have friends like Ittai? How can I have friends like Zadok? How can I have friends like Abiathar? How can I have friends like Hushai? And how can I have friends like Shobi and Machir and Barzillai? How can I have friends like that?
Well, for example, he his mistakes, but he knows when to stay sword. He knows when to protect his people. So you live the life it bounces back at you.
Most of these people are David's friend because of the life that he has lived in their presence. Very true.
We always say walk the talk, right?
Yeah.
All these friends have foundational elements in God, like they're priests, like he's brought a Philistine into the fold of God. He meets Hushai like on the God where or on the mountain where they worshiped God. Like, it's just interesting that like God's central into the connection with all of these people.
So you've got the way you're living your life, the God focus of your life. Ultimately, the best way to have a friend like this is to be a friend. And that may be the thing. I think that is the thing I would want to leave with you tonight. We leverage the opportunities God places in front of us to be these kinds of friends. Because we probably all at some point in our lives have had someone, not necessarily a king in distress, but we have known someone that we can be that kind of friend to. If that has not happened, it will happen because it's called life. So next week, we'll look at good advice and bad advice. We'll go back into chapter 16 and finish up 16 and 17. And then I think we're going to have time to get through because the actual battle of the troops really doesn't take up a whole lot of space in the text. Like a route.
That's also not the main deal.
Yeah. So let's pray. We'll be done for tonight. Thank you, God, for your word. And Lord, thank you for the things that you have shown us tonight. Help us to be what you have called us to be, to keep our hearts and our eyes and our minds focused on you. Lord, through all the difficulties of David's life, through the bad parenting and the times that my focus might not have been where it needed to be, your inspired writer still called him a man after God's own heart. And Father, that gives us great hope. Lord, help us to be passionately pursuing your heartbeat. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, everybody online, for hanging with us tonight. We appreciate you guys. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.